My name is Emily Underwood. I work in community engagement at the Missouri Historical Society. And on behalf of MHS, I want to welcome you to our STL History Live program today. And thank you so much for joining us virtually for the story of Cahokia, presented by Bill Eisminger in collaboration with the Cahokia Mounds Museum Society. Safety is a top priority, so nearly all of our programming is virtual right now, but the museum is open Wednesday through Sunday with several safety precautions in place. We would love for you to visit if you feel safe doing so. Advanced reservations are required to visit all of the Missouri Historical Society locations, including the History Museum, Soldiers Memorial Military Museum, and our Library and Research Center. And you can visit mohistory.org to plan your visit and reserve your free tickets. This program is being presented in conjunction with the Mighty Mississippi exhibit that's now open through June 6th at the Missouri History Museum. This exhibit puts the grandeur of North America's greatest river in context with the cultures that have grown and thrived around it, and it sheds light on how sustaining surrounding communities has long depended on wisely caring for the river and its resources. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Bank of America, for their support of the exhibit, and I also want to thank JSM Charitable Trust, who is our education sponsor. And I also, of course, want to thank our collaborators today, the Cahokia Mounds Museum Society, and you'll also see them here on the sponsor list for the exhibit. The grounds at Cahokia Mounds are currently open every day from sunrise to sunset, and the Interpretive Center is open Thursdays through Sundays. So I highly recommend paying them a visit as well, and you can get more information about them at cahokiamounds.org. And finally, last but not least, of course, I want to thank all of the Missouri Historical Society members who are tuning into this program, and those who aren't tuning into this program. We're so grateful for all of your support. And if you're not a member yet, of course, we'd love for you to consider joining, and you can get more information about our membership at mohistory.org/support. So I hope you check that out. And of course, I want to thank everyone in the St. Louis City and County area for your tax contributions through the Zoo Museum Tax District. We're going to go ahead and get started with the program today. I'm excited to introduce our speaker to you. Bill Eisminger, who's also known as Mr. Mounds, started working at Cahokia Mounds after graduating with a master's degree in archaeology from Southern University, Illinois in Carbondale. He was on staff full-time for almost 49 years, and he retired in December, but is currently still working at the site part-time. He's written several books related to Cahokia, including one called Cahokia Mounds, America's First City. He's working on another book about the stone tablets, like the Birdman tablet that have been found throughout the country. And he's here today to share with us a little bit of the story of Cahokia as a place where people lived and as a place where people now study. And so I'm going to turn the screen over to him and welcome Bill.
Thank you very much. Glad to be invited to speak to your group. For those of you who aren't familiar with Cahokia Mounds, it's part of what we call the Mississippian culture. And as you can see on the map here, the shaded area represents the core of the Mississippian world, with a few outliers up into Wisconsin and Minnesota and Iowa and into eastern Oklahoma and Texas. But it was an area where people shared a lot of cultural traditions, certain types of house construction, certain types of pottery, certain types of stone tools. And we sort of lumped together under that term Mississippian. So it's really, though, many different tribes who spoke different languages, but did things much the same way that, again, we call Mississippian. A lot of interaction, a lot of trade going on between people throughout this region. And Cahokia is sort of toward the northern part of this Mississippian world. But it certainly had influence over that whole area. And it's a more immediate area, it probably had more control, but throughout a much larger region, it was more of an influence factor. Because we do find artifacts apparently made at Cahokia throughout much of that Mississippian world. And also we find things from those different areas at Cahokia. So there's a lot of interaction, a lot of trade, a lot of communication. The squares you see on the map represent some of the major mound centers, but there'd be thousands of smaller villages and towns and hamlets and farmsteads scattered all around those. But it gives you an idea of how big an area that we're talking about of people who shared certain common characteristics, again, that we call Mississippian. Okay. On a more local level, the sort of gray area you see in the map here is what we call the American Bottom. It's a floodplain of the Mississippi River, with the uplands on both the east and west side shown in green. But all the little, the star, of course, represents Cahokia, but the squares and the circles and triangles represent different sizes of communities that were part of sort of what we call Greater Cahokia. And there were major mound centers at Cahokia with about 120 mounds and a population that may have been anywhere from 10 to 20,000 people at its peak. But there also were mound groups in East St. Louis, about 50 mounds there. And in downtown St. Louis, just north of the Arch, was the St. Louis Mound Group, about 26 or 7 mounds just north of the Arch. And so that's sort of the main administrative complex area that some people refer again as Greater Cahokia. But there were other groups of about 12 mounds at the southern end of the map, with where you see the Pulcher site, and up towards the north, the Mitchell site, about a dozen mounds at each of those centers. And then you see circles that may have represent 1 or 2 mounds at some more sort of local centers. Then all the little triangles are representing moundless little hamlets and farmsteads. But probably all of these people were under Cahokia's control in some way. Perhaps the further away, the less control there was. But it was all part of this sort of metropolitan area. And as we say, Cahokia was America's first city. It was the largest, not just here, but it was the largest prehistoric Indian settlement in America, the largest north of Mexico. And it covered about 6 square miles, about 120 mounds or so. So this is kind of what we're going to be focusing on today in the program. So we'll go on to the next slide and talk about Cahokia more specifically. This is a map that shows the distribution of the 120 or so mounds that were at Cahokia. Now, a lot of those mounds are gone now because of farming activity, highways, subdivisions, discount stores, etc. But we currently have about 80 mounds that survive in some form or another. And fortunately, we now have over 70 of those protected as part of Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site, which is managed by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. So at the center is the biggest mound, Monk's Mound. We'll be talking more about that a little bit later. And it was surrounded by those shaded areas we call plazas. Just south of Monk's Mound, the biggest mound is the Grand Plaza. But there were other plazas to the north, south, east, and west. Some not exactly shown on here, some are shown. But this was a very complex community, as we'll see as we get into the details of the presentation. Okay. Next. So this painting kind of gives us an idea of the sort of downtown area of Cahokia Mounds. At the center again is Monk's Mound overlooking the Grand Plaza. But as you can see, we're not even looking at the whole site here, just the major sort of central and eastern portion of it. But there will be all kinds of spaces used for public activities, others for residential activities, others for agricultural. So the next slide kind of isolates some of the topics that we'll be talking about as we go through the program here. So Monk's Mound, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail later, but it dominated the site. It's more or less at the center of the site. And from there, about 1.5 miles in all directions, you'd be within the boundaries of what we refer to as the Cahokia site. And south of it is the Grand Plaza with the twin mounds at the south end of the Grand Plaza, probably a mortuary complex. And Mound 72 just to the south or right of those, a very complex mortuary mound, which we'll get into a little more detail about. You notice also borrow pits. These little ponds and lakes have formed in some of the borrow pits where they dug up the dirt. They borrowed the dirt, in other words, to build the mounds. And that left holes in the ground that filled with water and became lakes and ponds. Some of these may have been stocked with fish, either intentionally or naturally. But they're mostly on the southern part of the site where there's a lot more clay in the soil, which you think was more suitable for mound construction. To the far left, we see Woodhenge, which is their sun calendar to tell the time of year by the alignment of the sunrises with posts that are in the circle as seen from the center post. And around the center of the city was a log wall we call the palisade or stockade. It was not there during the beginning of Cahokia's construction, but seemed to, after, a little before 1200 AD, it was first constructed. So it's a defensive wall or fortification. And again, we'll be talking in a little bit more detail about all those things as we go through the program. There are two creeks that came together behind Monk's Mound. Canteen Creek came in from the right or the southeast, and from the north, Cahokia Creek, and it zigzagged back and forth, eventually running into the Mississippi about 8 miles away, where East St. Louis is today. In the upper left is Horseshoe Lake, which is an old channel or meander of the Mississippi that was cut off probably 3,000 years or so ago, long before Cahokia. But there were villages and mounds around that, and probably most of the land for miles around Cahokia was used for agriculture, for growing the crops they needed to feed these people. And this was an agricultural-based society. It's the only way they could feed and maintain such a large population. And so besides corn, they're also growing, squash and pumpkin and sunflower and several seed-bearing plants, maygrass, little barley, the erect knotweed, marsh elder, lamb's foot, or lamb's quarter, or goosefoot. So these were crops that had been established thousands of years before, but during the time of Cahokia, it really doesn't become corn doesn't become a prominent food until about 900 AD. So about that time is when people began to kind of coalesce in this area. And around 1000 AD to 1050 is when Cahokia really began to develop into the big city that we recognize today. Okay. This is sort of an artist's perception of the center of Cahokia, looking between the twin mounds, which are a flat top mound on the right and a conical mound on the left. And the Grand Plaza beyond them. At the far end of the plaza is the dominating Monk's Mound. So the Grand Plaza was a large open space. It actually covered over 40 acres, and was where they would have public gatherings, ceremonies, festivals, games, markets, and other kinds of public activities. And along the edges of the Grand Plaza is probably where some of the more elite of the society lived. But we know there were various other elite areas beyond the walled district of the center of Cahokia. But in the center, we can see a depiction of what we call a chunky yard or a chunky game field. This was a game that was played by Mississippians and also by later people that we have some documentation for, throwing or rolling a round sort of disc-shaped stone on its edge along the field, and competitors would then throw lances or spears in an attempt to predict where that stone would stop rolling, or probably hit it sometimes, but mainly it was to be closest to where it stopped rolling. This is based on later descriptions. So you can imagine all kinds of those kinds of public activities going on in the Grand Plaza. Okay. I mentioned all these other Mississippian sites in Cahokia as being part of the Mississippian world. And they were involved in extensive trade with these distant areas. They were bringing exotic materials in that are not native to this area, such as seashell coming from the Gulf of Mexico and the Florida coast. We're getting copper, and it came from around Lake Superior. We're getting mica, it came from the southern Appalachians of North Carolina and Tennessee. We're getting a lot of minerals that came from the Ozarks and chert or flint from many sources throughout the Midwest. So these were trade items that we see in earlier cultures too, but it seems to be more formalized during this Mississippian time and in greater quantities than we had seen in earlier periods. In this illustration, we're showing us some of Cahokia's elites trading for some of these exotic materials in the North Plaza. You can see Monk's Mound in the background. And in the middle, going across the middle, is Cahokia Creek, with people in their dugout canoes bringing in materials for the city of Cahokia. Dugout canoes were the main form of transportation at that time. So the rivers were the highways, the interstates back in those days. And with several rivers coming together near here, we have the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Illinois rivers joining in a confluence here, which gave them access to the resources and other peoples throughout the drainage systems of those rivers. So this was probably one of the reasons Cahokia became as big as it did. But we don't know the exact reason. For some reason, it became bigger than anything else, including sites that were contemporary around it, like we saw on that other map. So we don't know if it's something that happened here, something about the location itself, or whether there was a powerful or charismatic leader that drew people in. So all of a sudden, around 1050 AD, we see a sudden explosion of population from just a few thousand people, maybe to as many as 10. Some people think 15 to 20,000 could have been here in Cahokia proper. And you could double that number for some of these surrounding communities. So it really became a metropolitan area. For some reason, Cahokia dominated all this. Okay. This is a view of some of the village areas around the Grand Plaza as we're looking toward Monk's Mound in the distance. But in the foreground, you can see typical forms of Mississippian houses. This is based on the archaeological work that's been done, where we find evidence of where houses once stood, or houses that sometimes burned down and preserved the materials that they were made of, and in which things that were contained in them. So these were basically single family dwellings. Sometimes they're clustered in groups like you see here. Perhaps sisters had their houses adjacent to each other and would share cooking and storage activities. And on the left, you can see a house under construction. It's basically a pole framework. The wall posts are set into narrow trenches that were dug in a rectangular pattern. And then the part that stood above the ground was covered with several layers of mats, or in some cases, as they're showing here, plastered with clay, what we call wattle and daub construction. You have saplings woven between the upright wall posts and then plastered over with a mixture of clay and grass. And the roofs are made with native prairie grass, which grows 6 or 7 to 8 feet tall. Bundles of those were tied on in overlapping layers like shingles, so to speak. And this provided protection against the weather. A house might last maybe about 10 years or more before it had to be replaced or rebuilt. And we often see houses being rebuilt many times in the same location, like probably by the same family and their descendants. In the middle, you can see some activities that were going on in the Grand Plaza. On top of Monk's Mound was the largest building we know for the site. In fact, it's probably the largest Mississippian structure there was, over 100 feet long and about 50 feet wide. Other terraces or elevations on the mound had other structures and smaller mounds and other kinds of activities. So it kind of gives you a feeling for what it might have looked like. Okay. We see 3 types of mounds at Cahokia. Here, again, the twin mounds. On the distance there, you can see a rectangular flat top mound, which is the most typical variety for Mississippian period. In the foreground is the conical, what we call round top mound. And these are sort of a carryover from the earlier woodland tradition, where that form of mound was used primarily for burial purposes. And that seems to continue a lot during Mississippian times. But the majority of the people were not buried in mounds, but in cemeteries throughout the city. Just some of the more important people or special types of burials that are sometimes found with mound associations. The flat, the flat top mound probably had a building on it. And most likely would have been a charnel house, like a funeral home, basically, where the bodies of important people were prepared for burial or stored for burial until the proper time for the burials, and then perhaps buried later in the conical mound adjacent to it. Now, these have not been dug at Cahokia, these two, but we know from other Mississippian sites that kind of situation was not unusual. So we think it's probably true here as well. Okay. The third type of mound at Cahokia, and it's kind of unique to the Cahokia region, is called a ridgetop mound. Here's an aerial photograph from 1922, one of the first aerial photographs made of an archaeological site. And this particular photo focusing on what's called Powell Mound at the western edge of the Cahokia site. You can see it's longer, longer than it is wide, and it comes to a crest on the top, kind of like a roof does. And these are found along the major north, south, and east-west axes of the site. So we sometimes refer to them as marker mounds, but they also seem to have mortuary functions as well. So it's again kind of a unique mound form for the Cahokia area. Unfortunately, this mound was destroyed by a farmer back in the 1930s when he used the dirt to fill the low area you see at the bottom of the photo. It's probably where the Mississippians dug up the dirt to build the mound, but he was trying to increase his crop production area. So unfortunately, it was lost. Okay. When we dig into a mound, we do it in a controlled way using usually a metric system, and we dig in squares that are tied in to a master measuring system we use for the whole site. So everybody here digs here has to tie into that master grid. And so the strings you see laid out are part of that grid system projected onto the excavation. Here we dug into a mound, actually part of Monk's Mound, and we can see the actual basket loads of dirt that are piling up to build this mound. That's how we know this is not a hill, a natural formation, but a man-made structure, and probably woman-made as well. And you can notice the lenses of different color soil. You've got light sort of tan soil, and you get light gray and dark gray. This gives us an idea how big a basket load was. They were getting dirt from different places or different levels within a borrow pit where the soil is different colors and textures. And they're piling that up and packing that down. And we can still see the basket loading when we dig into a mound like this. Next. Another parts of Monk's Mound, as you see here, instead of piling the dirt up, they're kind of spreading it out in layers, but alternating kind of light and dark colored soils. Again, sandier soils followed by clay-like soils and silty soils. So they're doing some soil engineering. They're selecting the soils that they're using for their properties or perhaps even their colors. You know, there's some debate about whether the mounds were actually grass covered like you see in a lot of the illustrations or were bare earth. And the trend right now in our thinking is that more of them were probably bare earth, and it may have been the color of the soil that had symbolic meaning as well. But that means they had to do a lot of repairs every time it rained. Gullies would wash out. In fact, in our excavations, we have seen evidence of such a thing happening. We can see where gullies formed in the sides of the mound that were then patched with basket loads of dirt. They're doing repairs. Now, it may be something you had to do every so many years or during certain bad weather episodes. Okay. This is an aerial view of Monk's Mound. Again, the largest mound at Cahokia and the largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas. In the Western Hemisphere, this is the largest totally earthen structure built by ancient people. And again, it covers about 14 acres. It's 100 feet high. And it has several different terraces or levels across the front of the mound. You can see what we call the first terrace. And on the left side, what we call the second terrace is very irregular. And there's been a whole lot of erosion and slumping over the years in the past, as well as in recent times. And we continue to have some problems with that area. Then up on top, there are the third and the fourth terrace, the third terrace on the front half of the top and the fourth terrace on the back half. We think that perhaps the second terrace used to be at the top and collapsed. And maybe even took part of that building on top of the mound with it. And then when that happened, because of their having fears of the front of the mound collapsing, we think that's when they added the first terrace across the front to help stabilize the front of the mound. And they probably shifted some of the activities from the top down to that first level. On the left corner of the first terrace, we found there's a small mound there that had been built over some ritual buildings and then been added to several times. Each time it would have a new building on top of it, sometimes just a few inches of soil. but it seems like there is ritual activity taking place on that terrace as well. And where the stairs go up the front, Washington University dug on the south ramp, right just the other side of the highway there, back in the early 70s. And again, SIU Edwardsville did some more dig there in the 1990s when we built the new stairway system up the mound. But they could see evidence of where the Mississippians had what appeared to be some kind of a stairway system at those locations. Of course, the wood is gone, but we can see impressions in the soil suggesting where log steps may have been. Okay. Mound 72 is one of the smallest mounds at the site, and it is about 140 feet long, about 70 feet wide. It's a ridgetop mound. It's one of the few mounds that's had extensive excavations into it. From 1967 to 1971, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee conducted excavations here. They were curious about the mound, first of all, because of its small size, the fact that it's a ridgetop mound, there's only a few of those, and it occurred along what one archaeologist referred to as a north-south center line of Cahokia. And he thought if he dug at the left end of the mound, as seen in the photo here, which is the southeast end, he might find where a big post or a marker had been, and he was curious about that. And the mound is oriented a little bit differently than the other mounds, which I think we'll see in the next slide, which is a map of the excavations. Okay? Yes. So at the southeast end of the mound on the far right here, where it says F1, that's where he actually did find where a big post had been, like a marker post at one time, along that north-south center line of the site. And so it was kind of neat to find something you predict in archaeology, and mostly we're surprised. And we were certainly surprised as we did more excavations into this mound. You can see the general orientation from the top, which is the northwest, to the south, to the right, which is the southeast. It sits at a different angle than most of the other mounds at the site. And coincidentally, that does align with the winter solstice sunrise and the summer solstice sunset. And there apparently are lunar alignments that people are looking at now that are seen to be associated with this orientation, not only for this mound, but for others at the site as well. So as they dug into this mound, what they discovered is that there's actually 3 smaller mounds beneath Mound 72, which they say is only about 7 feet high if you look at it today. But beneath those 3 smaller mounds, one at each end and one in the middle, were complex burial mortuary complexes. Near the big post, where it says F101, there was what we call the beaded burial. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But and there were people buried around and under him. He's laid on a blanket of about 20,000 shell beads made out of marine shell. In the center, feature 105, there was a burial pit that had 53 young women in it. There may be a few young men as well, but laid out in 2 rows and piled in there 2 deep, all about anywhere from 12 to 25 years old. Next to them, feature 106, were 4 men laying side by side with their arms interlocked, but their heads and their hands have been cut off, apparently in some ritual. As you go up to the left, feature 236 and 214, and I think it's 204. These were another series of mass graves, mostly young women. One had 19, another had 24, another had 22 of them. Again, laid out, armed shoulder to shoulder and stacked in there 2 deep. And these were in pits, several feet deep. And so something very unusual is going on here. At the lower part of on the left of the slide here, you can see some other mass graves. Upper and lower of feature 229. It was a deep pit about 6 feet deep, and the upper layer had 15 people who'd been carried there on litters or stretchers. In fact, you could still see the cedar poles laying alongside them. And men and women and different ages. And beneath them were 39 people who had just been tossed in. They weren't carefully laid out like the ones above them. And they looked like they'd been clubbed and pushed into this pit. So who were these people? We don't really know for sure. We know that you see people given differential burial treatment, indicates they're treated differently in life. Perhaps the people on the bottom of that particular pit were the enemy, and they maybe killed the people laying on the stretchers above them, but we don't know. There's all kinds of scenarios you can imagine for some of these things. But a lot of this appears to be human sacrifice. In other words, these are people who were selected to be sacrificed into the afterlife for whatever reasons. We don't have the answers to those questions. There's a lot of speculation, obviously, but a lot of unusual things going on. But it wasn't all at once. This was a series of events. Each these little mounds built over these burials occurred at a different time. There were some later intrusive burials into some of those. So there's a continuation of the use of this area for ritual activity for as much as 100 years or more. But it's at the beginning of Cahokia, starting around a little before 1000 in the late 900s up until about 1100 AD. So again, and there's been a new study by the University of Illinois analyzing the isotopes in the teeth and bones of these people. And they can determine from that probably 70% of the people in these mass graves were from the local area. But 30%, up 25 to 30% were non-local. In other words, they got here from somewhere else. They were perhaps born somewhere else, either came here through immigration, through marriage, through captivity. There's all kinds of scenarios, again, that can explain some of these origins. But for whatever reason, and we see more evidence, not just here at Cahokia, but a lot of the surrounding sites too, that people were immigrating into this area, especially after that, around 1010-50 AD. So something was drawing people in from distant areas. And we can see from the pottery and other kinds of artifacts, they're coming from northeastern Arkansas and southeast Missouri and southern Indiana, maybe northern Kentucky. So they're adding to the population that was already here. Okay. So the beaded burial I talked about is in the center here, and it was a male in his 20s, and underneath his left shoulder there, you can see in blue, a female. Now, we used to think from the initial studies done when the first excavations took place that these are two men in their 40s, but with the reanalysis by the University of Illinois, we now know that these were a male and a female. And they're laying on this blanket of about 20,000 shell beads. So it actually has kind of a shape that resembles a bird. By the male's skull, there's, you can see it looks like the head of a bird, and extending down his body toward his feet is the wings by the side and the tail. So it's kind of a stylized falcon or hawk image. And this is a very common theme, the Birdman kind of theme in Mississippian art too. But also around them were other people. Some were buried right when they died, like the fellow on the far right here, and also to the left of the beaded burial. But also there's others that are what we call bundle burials to the right of the couple on the beaded blanket. And also there's some that are kind of hard to see here because they're just fragmentary, but these are what we call bundle burials. People who had already died previously and their bones were gathered up and reburied with these people. So we don't know if these were all relatives or attendants or what their relationship was at this point to the people on the beaded blanket. But again, a very unusual and unique complex. And next to them were 7 men and women, and piled on top of them were some of the grave offerings that were honoring apparently this royal couple. Okay. Here you see the excavations in the center. There were 15 of those chunky stones. It's unusual to find one, but here we had a pile of 15 of them, all perfectly made. These were these game stones I was mentioning earlier. And this is some people think that the game may have actually started at Cahokia. On the bottom, that long linear thing is actually a roll of copper. Was probably wrapped around a wooden shaft. Copper comes from around Lake Superior and occurs in pure nuggets up there, and it was traded throughout the eastern part of North America. And they would take those nuggets and heat them and hammer them, flatten them out into thin sheets, almost like a foil, which are then wrapped around, in some case like this, a wooden object, or maybe some of the ear and headdress ornaments and other types of ornaments they had. Probably very few people had. That was their precious metal. That was their gold. Probably only the elite would have access to that. On the right, you can see that shiny stuff is that mica I mentioned from North Carolina, Tennessee area. And we feel sometimes lucky to find one little piece of it, but here we had almost 2 bushels of the raw material, not made into anything yet, but was sometimes made into beads or bangles. It may have been sewn on the clothing. It may have been crushed into a powder that would be used like glitter to apply to the body for ornamentation and ceremonies, things like that. So again, some unusual things here. And at the very bottom, you can see some shell beads again, made out of seashell. Okay. There were 2 piles of arrowheads. One of them you see here, over 350 or so in this pile. And notice how they're all pointing in one direction. So probably full arrows with wooden shafts were buried, but the wood is decayed away by now. But you notice there's different styles. Notice the notching. Some have notches just on the side. Some have an additional notch on the bottom. Some have serrated edges. Some taper more at the point. So these are indications that these are probably made by different groups of people as tribute to this particular couple. Next. This is the second pile, again about 370 or so in this pile. Again, notice their orientation like full arrows, probably even in quivers or tied in bundles that were deposited here. But also notice the different colors of the chert or flint and the shapes and styles of the points. So, and then they're made out of material that chert or flint is, chert is the more common term that we use as archaeologists. But it came from Wisconsin, Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Illinois. We can tell by the type of material and the styles of the points as well indicate some of those distant origins. So people were paying tribute. Okay. Now I mentioned earlier the palisade or the stockade wall that once enclosed the central sacred ceremonial precinct of Cahokia. And it was basically a fort to protect that central precinct, but it wasn't built at the beginning of Cahokia. Remember, the beginning was around 1000 AD or 1050 when it really started to grow, but the first wall was not built until about 1175 or a little before 1200. And so we see not just Cahokia, but a lot of Mississippian sites, large and small, are being fortified at this time. So it shows to us that warfare and conflict were a common part of this Mississippian culture, as people were, I guess, competing with each other for resources, for authority and power, etc. The first time they built the wall of Cahokia, like in the upper left here, it had small round bastions. About every 90 feet along the wall, there were bastions. These project outward from the wall, would have raised platforms inside them that the warriors could stand on to shoot out against anybody attacking or catch them in a crossfire between the towers. After a while, that wood, the part that's in the ground especially, will begin to rot because of the moisture and insects, and they would replace it and build a new wall. And the second wall, like you see in the upper right, had large square-shaped towers. The bottom, you can see the third and fourth time the walls were built, the towers became progressively smaller and were open on the back side. Probably an attempt to conserve on how much wood they're using, or beginning to run out of trees, just to build one wall like this. And it was almost 2 miles long around the center of their city. Would take 15 to 20,000 logs each time. They probably recycle as many as they could. But again, it's basically replacing a wall that became old and weak and with decay. So it shows that a threat was continuing. Now, who was threatening them? This was the biggest place around. This was the biggest city. But it had to be other Mississippians at that time, because that's all it was around. About we don't know, it was people from the local area rebelling against Cahokia's authority, or people from more distant areas challenging them, making raids from time to time. But it shows that the threat did continue for at least 100 years, during which they built this wall between 1175 and 1275 AD. Okay. This is a partial reconstruction at one of the original locations after excavations took place. And it shows you what, the size of one of these walls. It probably stood above the ground, about 10 to 12 feet tall. And we think the walls may have also been plastered with clay, this daub we talked about, like some of the structures had on them. We haven't found positive proof of that here at Cahokia yet, but some of the other Mississippian sites like Aztalan in Wisconsin and Angel Mounds in Indiana, and historical accounts, the DeSoto Entrada down in the South in the 1500s, he encountered people still living the Mississippian way of life down there and had their sites fortified with walls that he described looked just like this. So we probably think the walls may have been plastered with clay to help protect from weather and fire and make them last a little bit longer. Where we've dug so far, we haven't seen evidence of the wall being attacked or burned or destroyed, but maybe it's just not in the areas we've found, or maybe they never were attacked. But the threat of attack existed long enough they felt the need to keep building this wall. Okay. We've also reconstructed Woodhenge at our site. Back in the early 1960s, Interstate 5570 was being built off to the left of the picture, out of the behind where those trees are. And there was supposed to be another interstate coming in from the south, or to our right, that would intersect with Interstate 5570. And so archaeologists from the Illinois State Museum are doing excavations to see what was here at this particular location where ramps and clover leaves would be. In the process, they found hundreds of houses and pits and other kinds of features. So it showed it was an intense residential area at one time. But they noticed a lot of big, large post pits. And Dr. Warren Witry, who was in charge of the project, was perplexed by that. So he made a separate map that just had the post pits. And he realized they were forming arcs of circles. He could identify at least 4 circles, he believed. And he suggested then that this might be some kind of a Woodhenge or sun calendar. So his colleagues came back in 1963, followed up and found more of the posts in the circles and the center post. And he came back himself again in 1977 and 78 to follow this particular circle out as much as he could. And I had a final excavation in 1985 to find the last few posts that we needed to do a reconstruction. And we had a local couple that donated funds for reconstructing the Woodhenge. So we now know that it was built at least 5 times at this location. The first one was the smallest, it was about 240 feet in diameter with 24 posts. It would have been just to the east of this particular circle. In fact, that mound, which you see just the other side of the post, covered part of where that first circle had been. So it shows the mounds a little bit later. All the other circles were built about where this one is. But each time they built it, they increased the number of posts and the diameter of the circle. So this one represents the third circle, which was 410 feet in diameter and would have had 48 posts. In the excavations, Dr. Witry did find fragments of red cedar in some of the post holes. So when we reconstructed it, we tried to use as many red cedar posts as we could get. So about at least half of them were red cedar. But this is the center post in front of us here, which is a little bit larger than some of the others. But from that position on the center post, maybe the sun priest on a platform near the top of it would watch the sunrise each morning. And when it lined up with certain posts, it marked important dates in their ritual calendar. At the far left, you can just barely see a post that has a little bit of a white stripe on it. That's where the summer solstice sunrise would be as seen from the center post. You go 4 posts to the right and you see one with 2 stripes on it. That's the equinox. That's where the spring and fall equinox is when rises due east. And notice that in the background, far distance, you can see Monk's Mound, the top of Monk's Mound sticking up. And notice how that post lines up with the front slope of Monk's Mound. Okay, well, we'll see in a slide in a minute that will make that kind of pop out to you. Then you go another, yeah, there we go. And you go another 4 posts to the right, and there's one with 1 stripe on it. That's the winter solstice sunrise. So it's really only those posts on the eastern arc that are critical for aligning with the sunrises. So why have a full circle? We think part of it is symbolic. The sun is a disk or a circle in the sky. The circle represents the cycles of life, the cycles of the seasons. So we think they were symbolizing that concept in the construction of this. And it also encloses a sacred space where they could have the rituals associated with the sacred calendar. Now we go out there, we have gatherings. Normally, we have to limit some of those because of COVID as we come up into this spring, but we are planning to do a winter solstice observation. We do our observations on the Sunday morning closest to the actual event. So you go to our website at cahokiamounds.org, you'll find information about times that we meet out at the Woodhenge itself. And this is an equinox, a fall equinox. A couple of years ago, we had about 150 people showed up that day. And fortunately, the sun showed up too, as you can see, and it does look like it's coming right out of the front of Monk's Mound. And we think that's more than a coincidence, because more than likely the leader on top of the mound would probably be thought to be associated with the sun god or his solar brother, and to have the sun coming out of his mound would certainly reinforce his power and authority and his association with the upper world, where a lot of these powerful spiritual forces reside. So you're welcome to join us sometime if you're in the area and want to come out. When again, these are sunrises, so they're in the morning, and of course that varies from time to time throughout the year. But again, check our websites for the dates and times. Okay, next. So several years ago, in fact, about 30 years ago, we built a new museum at Cahokia. The old museum used to be to the left of Monk's Mound. It was a little old ranger's residence that we converted into a small museum, but really needed something more adequate to tell the story of Cahokia. And so where you see the building on the right, that is the Interpretive Center. It was opened in 1989. But all that area to the left of it and south of Monk's Mound used to be a housing subdivision. About 60 some houses were there, built in the 1940s and 50s. And fortunately, we were able to do land acquisition without eminent domain and acquired those properties and had the houses eventually removed or sold them, auctioned them off, and the people who bought them had to move them. And we've restored then the Grand Plaza and the vista across the Grand Plaza to Monk's Mound from the Interpretive Center. SIU Edwardsville did excavations for the location of the new facility over about a 2.5-year period in the mid-1980s. And they found evidence of over about 80 houses and several hundred pits of various types. So we can see how one of Cahokia's neighborhoods evolved over about a 200-year period through their excavations. Okay. This is the entrance to the Interpretive Center. And like I say, it opened in 1989, and we were fortunate. The reason we probably got the funding for it, because in 1982, the Cahokia site was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List. We're one of, at that time, when we first were added to that list, we were number 10 in the United States. And there are probably about 400 some worldwide. Today there's 23 or 4 sites now on the World Heritage List from the United States and over 1,000 worldwide. But so we're in good company with the Great Wall of China and the pyramids and Taj Mahal, and there's natural sites too, like Grand Canyon, the Everglades, and other cultural sites as well throughout the world. So the state, I think, felt at that time they needed to build a new facility that really told the story of Cahokia in a much more adequate way. And the excavations, like I said, took place over 2 period, and then we had the, go ahead, and we had the building open in 1989. And throughout the exhibit gallery. You can see there are islands, each one with a different topic and theme, and the artifacts, the displays, the models, the illustrations, the maps, and other features on those islands all accent the various topics. And to our right in this photo is actually a reconstructed village, life-size, with mannequins, actually cast from living Indian people. Been involved in daily activities, so you get a feeling what it was like. And you know, the old museums used to have just rows and rows of artifacts. Here, we do have a lot of artifacts, but we're also showing how they're made from the raw material to the finished product, how they fit into the life of the people. We talk about structures, we talk about the city, we talk about their belief system, their technology, as well as the archaeology, how we know all this, how we learn this. So if you haven't been to our Interpretive Center, we encourage you to visit. We're open Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We're closed on Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays right now. But we hope to maybe someday get back to a bigger schedule once we get better staffing and once the virus thing is over with. But the grounds are open every day from dawn to dusk. And we do keep boxes of brochures and things by the front door. There are interpretive trails throughout the site, and interpretive signage too explains all the major site features that we've talked about today. So even if you're there when we're closed, you can experience Cahokia and learn more about it. So that's kind of a quick look at Cahokia and what we know about it, and I'd be glad to answer questions of people. They can write to us through our website at cahokiamounds.org or let's see, cahokia.mounds@sbcglobal.net. That's I answer most of the questions on that particular email. So you can also call us at 618-346-5160. And if you need more information, we'll try and get it to you.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was wonderful. I am going to ask you a few questions too before we sign off. I know you can answer all kinds of questions about Cahokia, but I have a question about you. I'd like to know how you got to Cahokia. What's your story? I mean, you stayed there for 49 years plus now. So
Right.
How'd you get there, and what kept you there?
Well, my interest in archaeology began as a kid. I was born in Illinois, but I grew up in Arlington, Virginia. My father's family was from Hayworth, Illinois, in the center of the state. And when we come to Illinois for family vacations or visits, his brother, my Uncle Wendell, would often take us kids out into the cornfields around McLean County and look for artifacts. That really stimulated my interest. And I think I knew since 6th or 7th grade I wanted to be an archaeologist. When I graduated from high school, I went to the University of Oklahoma, where I got my undergraduate degree in anthropology. And one summer then I had worked at a site in South Dakota for the Smithsonian River Basin Survey. Later, when I went to Southern Illinois University at Carbondale for my graduate work, where I got my master's in anthropology, I worked the first summer at a place called Dixon Mounds in central Illinois, because the State Museum was building a new museum there and they needed to do excavations before they did their construction. So that was my introduction to working in Illinois. And since then, most all my work's been in Illinois. When I was at Carbondale, I did a survey of the where Kincaid Creek used to be. It's now Kincaid Lake. But we had to do excavations and surveys to locate sites before the lake was formed. And also the southern 30 miles of the Kaskaskia River, which was being straightened out for barge traffic. So we were we found over 180 sites and did a couple excavations on that. And then I also had worked one summer in 1968 at Cahokia as a shovel hand. And I kept in touch with my people I'd worked for, and I was at an annual archaeology conference for Illinois archaeologists in 1970, and ran into my former supervisor, and we were talking. He said, "Well, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm looking for a job. I'm just finishing up my master's. I'm not going on for the PhD, and looking for a job." And he said, "How would you like to work at Cahokia?" And I said, "Yeah, twist my arm." And to start out, he had just been hired by the State Museum to help develop what we now call the Old Museum, and interpretive programs and public tours and other kinds of special activities. And he was needing an assistant. So I was hired, then some other people as well eventually. But that's really how I ended up at Cahokia. I never looked anyplace else or thought about going anyplace else. You start your career at the largest site in the country. And like I say, I never thought about going anyplace else.
You got there right away.
So here I am, still here.
Well, I'm curious, you mentioned during your presentation a number of different sort of like mysteries of Cahokia, things that, there's conjectures about, but not certainty about in terms of relations with other groups and how certain things happened. I'm curious for you, what is the kind of mystery that you would love to know, the thing you'd love to have solved about Cahokia?
Well, we know quite a bit about what was going on when Cahokia was in its prime. The bigger questions are, how did it begin and how did it end? Now we have obviously speculation about that, and I often joke about sometimes you get 3 archaeologists in a room, you get 5 opinions, and we're all looking at the same data and in different ways though. But there's been a lot of research now, not just at Cahokia, but in some of the surrounding sites that are giving more information and more insights into the beginnings and ending. And we're trying to understand that better. And I think those are the big questions that intrigue most people. But we've done a lot of excavations at Cahokia, but when you consider the size of the site, almost 6 square miles, most digs are very small in size. But each one of them provides a little bit of new information. It repeats some old information, but also almost every one provides additional new information. But if you put all the digs together, probably less than 1% of the site's been dug. So there's still a lot to learn.
Wow. Yeah.
We're not trying to dig the whole. We never plan to dig the whole site. We just don't dig to be digging. There's always a research question or a goal that we're trying to answer. We think that digging in a certain location will help us answer those questions. Mm-hmm. We're using a lot of newer technology too, overall called remote sensing, where we use magnetic and electronic and radar types of equipment to drag those across the ground, and they can kind of detect subsurface differences in the soils where there's been disturbed by human activity. And so some of these can actually tell you where individual houses were, or pits, or other kinds of structures. So it helps us to focus where to dig. We can look at, now we're starting to see evidence of settlement patterns when you can do a whole field with these instruments, whereas a dig is, the size of a kitchen maybe. You can see patterns, and to understand those patterns though, those instruments produce computer maps, but we have to do what we call ground truthing to see if what we're seeing on those computer maps is really what's in the ground. So we might see a blob or sort of a rectangular pattern on these maps, but until you dig and actually show that's what a house looks like on these computer generated maps, or is that a rectangular pit, or is it a round pit that just looks square on the map? So there's a lot of things that have to be proven with the excavations, but it does help you to focus where to dig and focus your research.
So in terms of being an active research site, how often are digs occurring at Cahokia?
Well, there were a few scattered digs in the early and mid-20s that really led to the creation of Cahokia Mounds as a park initially, then later as a historic site. But it was mainly since the 1960s that excavations have been almost every summer at the site. And that really started with the construction of the interstates through the area, which actually go where Cahokia Creek used to be. Again, the Interstate 5570 pretty much follows the old creek bottom, which happened to be an old channel of the Mississippi thousands of years earlier. But and it was along that creek where Cahokia was settled, because they had to be near water sources. So there's been a lot of excavations, like I say, but they are focused in their research goals. But we are using a lot more of this remote sensing to help us determine where we want to dig, to help understand what we're seeing. So there have been some long-term projects following the stockade route, reopening an old excavation into Mound 34 by Washington University, to understand more about that mound that was dug by an amateur archaeologist back in the 50s. And so we're trying to minimize the impact our archaeology has on the site, because archaeology basically is you're destroying, but you're recording and documenting as you go. So it's controlled destruction. So we can basically put a puzzle piece back in where we're to the big puzzle of Cahokia with a lot of pieces missing, to understand, how different parts of the site were being utilized. We also have, so sometimes we go back and reopen an old excavation with the newer technology and information we have today to help us understand better what was seen back in the, say, 50s or 60s. And there's a lot more newer mapping techniques too. One called LIDAR that uses a sort of a laser sort of mapping of a site that can show very slight elevations that are covered by woods. You can eliminate the trees and things with the use of this LIDAR. And so we're starting to see other things that we hadn't noticed before, that are covered by woods or other types of ground cover. And so there's a lot of advances in technology that are really helping us to understand a little bit more about this site and how it coordinated with other Mississippian sites and other peoples.
Well, that actually leads me, I wanted to ask you one last question, and that segued perfectly into it. I was curious, you had shown at the very beginning the map with some of the different sites outside of the Missouri-Illinois region, extending all the way down into Georgia and other areas of the South. So how many of those sites, are any of those sites also active in terms of interpreting or active as dig sites? Do archaeologists working in Cahokia also communicate with people working at those sites? What's the relationship there?
Yes, there's, in fact, probably a large number of the sites you saw on that map are being actively excavated or researched, or the sites that are surrounding them. And each year there are conferences where the archaeologists dispense their results from their excavations. There's the Southeastern Archaeology Conference that focuses on more the southeastern region of North America. There's the Midwest Archaeology Conference. There's others. There's an international conference the Society for American Archaeology has. And so this is where students and professionals and others can share the results of their projects. And there are journals that each of these organizations produce. And a lot of books have come out in recent years on Cahokia, especially in the last 20 years. There have been dozens of books that have come out dealing with different aspects of Cahokia. So there's, we try to share our information as much as possible and compare what we're finding to what other people are finding.
Great. Well, Bill, I thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today. Thank you to everyone who's tuning in and listening to this presentation. I want to thank also, of course, again, our sponsors for the Mining Mississippi exhibit at the Missouri History Museum, our presenting sponsor, Bank of America, and our education sponsor, JSM Charitable Trust. And thank you to Cahokia Mounds Museum Society for working with us on this program today. If you are interested in seeing other programs that are part of our STL History Live series, You can find the whole lineup on the Missouri History Museum Facebook page or at mohistory.org. You can go to the events calendar there. And also you can find the recorded versions right here on YouTube, where you've probably found this one very, very likely. And hope you can check out more of those and join us again in the future. Programs again, Tuesdays at 11 a.m. and Thursdays at 6:30 p.m. And if you can't make it at those times, you can always catch them on YouTube later. So thank you again to all of you. Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. Really enjoyed it. We'll see you again another time.
Thank you.